Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next Now Written Live. This is episode 5, and I'm really excited today to be able to welcome Clarinda as my guest today. As you are, if you haven't listened to any of my other episodes, the aim of these sort of half an hour sessions is just to share sort of personal experiences about people who have lived experience of healthcare or any conditions that they live with, but also it's about defining what is missing in the healthcare system, whether it's data, whether it's ethnicity, different kinds of demographics that are underrepresented. So I'm really excited to have Clarinda on this call. I've known Clarinda for a few years now. We've sort of engaged a little bit here and there on LinkedIn, but I finally got to meet her in Seville for the Patient Engagement Open Forum event a couple of months ago. And I thought South Asian Heritage Month is now, and I thought it'd be really good to actually have Clarinda on, not because of just the fact that she's a South Asian lady, but also it's the difference between the UK and India. So I wanted to bring in that aspect, and yeah, so we'll get into it in a bit. But Clarinda, do you mind just introducing yourself?
Thanks so much for having me, Ashish. It's really nice to have these online connections materialize into these warmer friendships. So thanks for having me. So I'm Clarinda, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I live with a rare disease called neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder. I live in Mumbai. I'm a UPATI fellow, the first living in India. And my background is in science communication and originally biotechnology. And after several years in science communication, I was diagnosed with this rare disease and then multiple chronic conditions that came as sort of part of the package. So arthritis in various joints from steroid use and allergic asthma from immunosuppression. I think most people with rare diseases have a package. And about 4 years ago, I decided to turn my lived experience and my professional expertise into something that could make a difference to people, other patients, people in healthcare in general. And so I began to pursue patient advocacy and patient engagement full time. And that's pretty much what brings me here.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, I think that's the other thing I should have said is that you're one of the most experienced people that I know. You've worked across so many different projects and spectrums, so that's really, really exciting. But to start with, do you mind if we just sort of get into your sort of personal story? So start with your experience. And essentially what I'm trying to get across in this meeting is really around the difference between perceptions around India and healthcare and what is reality. So do you mind telling us about your journey with your condition? What did the diagnosis look like? And what were those like early phases of, navigating healthcare? What did that look like for you?
Yeah. I forgot to mention in my introduction, and my co-host will not be very happy about that, but I host a podcast called Not Just Patient. So I have shared my story multiple times, but always happy to do that as a patient advocate. So I was 25 and, living the regular full life of a young adult, busy life. And it kind of started with an itch at the back of my neck, which went on for about 3 weeks. And I kept asking people, can you check if there's a rash there? And nothing. There was nothing. Nobody could tell anything. I was just putting calamine lotion, could not figure out what was happening. And then in a span of 5 days, I had a fever. Water started feeling hot on one side of my body and cold on one side of my body. A single strand of hair on my neck would be excruciating. I had to put all my hair up in a way that nothing touched my neck. Very, very strange symptoms, never felt before. And then suddenly I had trouble lifting up my bag or anything. And I started losing sensation and motor function, pretty much became paralyzed in my left arm. And that's when I figured, okay, this is something neurological. And I went to a neurologist and I got an MRI, and it was deemed to be something called acute demyelination of the spinal cord. And I was admitted and I was given a course of oral of IV steroids, followed by oral steroids. The whole thing took over a month. I had physiotherapy to regain my hand function and everything. In a month, everything got back to normal, but I didn't have a diagnosis. When I kept asking, but why did this happen and what is the diagnosis, I was told that we have to wait to see if it recurs to be able to diagnose it. And I mean, now as a patient advocate, I also am an ambassador for the Sumaira Foundation, which works in the field of my own condition. And now I know that that was a function of lack of perhaps knowledge or expertise in this particular rare disease, because there were even at that time tests and markers available for a diagnosis from the first episode. But it took me 3 episodes essentially to land at a diagnosis over a span of 1 year. And the third episode, I would have lost function of my legs. I would have probably, like, it was, or I felt like my legs were getting paralyzed when I rushed to get treatment. And the critical aspect of this condition is that the earlier you get treatment, the better the prognosis. Now, I have been very fortunate in many ways that I happen to be, you could say it's a spectrum, and I happen to be on the milder end of the spectrum in general, and I responded to treatment. But essentially, that was the early diagnostic journey. And about a year in, I was diagnosed. There's a whole other aspect to the treatment bit, but I'll get to that. I'll allow you to come in if you have any follow-ups there.
Yeah, I think for me, it's interested to know what 25-year-old Clarinda felt, when you were going through that.
Yeah.
More like from a mental health perspective, because it's probably changing at that stage. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say that after the first episode, of course, I was looking it up and everything, and things looked bleak. But because the doctor was saying that if it recurs, we'll see. Right now, it could be a one-off thing, and we don't need to do anything more. We don't need to address it. And within a month, I was back to my old self. Everything was normal. For me, it felt like, okay, this was a blip. I don't know what happened, but incidentally, it was a very stressful period. It came on the back of a period of tremendous depression that I had gone through and all of that. And I mean, there are no definitive research indicators, but there are indicators that stress and autoimmune conditions are linked. That could be a possibility as well. But essentially, I recovered, and then I didn't really pay attention to it until I started having those relapses, in the second year. So, but then, yes, there was this kind of feeling of gloom, like my life is, oh, what is happening? My life is over right now. And more importantly, there was, when I got the name of my condition. So for the listeners here, it's NMO is a condition of the central nervous system that is similar to multiple sclerosis, and it can affect the function of any organ, to the point ranging from the lungs to the bowels to the urinary tract to essentially motor function of the limbs, sensory functions all across the body, because it is a central nervous system condition. And when I looked it up the first time I got the term, what I found was within 5 years, 50% patients find themselves in a wheelchair and 50% patients find themselves dead. Literally, that was the first Google hit. I was like, how can this be? Like, this is literally my life over, right? And there was that. And then I tried to look for support groups or anything like that. And I could only find one that seemed to be US based, and all I could see there was NMO has taken away my life. I've completely lost my eyesight. I have completely. I mean, it was literally story after story of no hope. I could not. I switched all that off, and I was like, "There's no way I want to read any of this. There's no way I want to associate with that. This cannot be my story." And so I literally disconnected, you could say, at that point. Yeah.
No, I think that sounds. Yeah, I can imagine it being an overwhelming scenario, and obviously you had a history of depression prior to that as well, and I, there's enough evidence out there to say it probably was linked, but not enough to prove it conclusively. But
Yeah.
what I really would like to know is, I think perception of India in the Western world is very different to what India, from my perspective, someone who is in the Western world and who visits India, is very different. So I'm always like blown away when I visit India and like, hold on, everyone, back in the UK or wherever, US, wherever, will see India as almost like still as a third world country. But really, what I'd like to understand is when, part of your NMO is you need highly specialist sort of neurology care and access to
Yeah.
immunotherapy. What did that, looking for that care, what did that look like in India? And were there any challenges?
Yeah. Essentially, once I got the diagnosis, it came to determining the way forward for treatment. And my consulting neurologist at that time was recommending this really aggressive approach, this treatment that was still in phase 4 trials, just new to the market, extremely expensive, unaffordable, because in India, medical care is pretty much out of pocket. And so essentially, the protocol was I would be admitted on a Saturday, get an infusion overnight, and through the week, I would have fever. And then I would do that every weekend for 6 weeks. And then it was essentially a chemotherapy drug. And then 6 months later, I would repeat this whole cycle. And the whole cost was more than the salary of members of my family, the annual salary. And we said to that doctor, we cannot afford this. And I mean, of course, not to mention that the treatment sounded completely brutal, and it sounded like, how this cannot be the only option. And I was a science communicator, so I pulled out research papers, and I had the clinical trials, the printouts. I had taken them to the doctor, and I had said, but I also see this option, I also see this option, what about this drug, what about this drug? And we said, but we can't afford this. And he said, what if I told you, he told my brother who was in the room with me, what if I told you your sister could be blind in 3 months? And that was his response. And we felt very dismissed, of course. And my mother said, we need to get a second opinion, and ideally somewhere else in the country. And so looking back, this was my first attempt at self advocacy, because I did the research and I found the country's best leading professional in the field. And I flew to Delhi to AIMS Neurology, and I met with this doctor. I can name him Dr. Rohit Bhatia because he saved my life, and I talk about him very proudly. But essentially, he spent 3 hours with me in that consultation. He went over my scans. He explained things to me. He gave me my first taste of shared decision making, basically. And he also explained to me that for the patient demographic that they deal with at a government, one of the biggest government institutions in India, they cannot prescribe the treatment that was being prescribed to me because patients cannot afford that. So he thought that that was a rather aggressive approach as the first line, and put me on an oral medication that was very affordable and pretty much, yeah, basically put me well, and my neuro condition has been well controlled ever since. So pretty much for 16 years in that sense. So
No, that's really good. That's really good. But I think for me is you're obviously a science communicator. You're from I don't know how to say it diplomatically, but like an educated background. But what about those people maybe from
exactly.
rural areas? What would happen with them in their journey in this? I don't know. I know you can't speak for everyone, but is it different?
So this is something that I'm so aware of every time and all the time, because the truth is that I represent a very, very, very small percentage of people in India. 6 to 10% of people in India speak English at all. Less than 5% people in India speak it fluently or like a first language.
Didn't know that.
And the language of medicine is English. The language of higher education is English in India. So that is such a huge gap, right? And then if you consider the economic barriers and everything else, like I feel like I'm in a position of extreme privilege to have everything I have, and to be connected on the global side as well. And now I have a community of other patients, and it is not as easy, definitely. There are extremely good professionals throughout the country and who are working in government institutions with excellent ethos. Like the professional I saw, the neurologist I saw, was in a government setup, but they are working under extreme resource constraints. It's unfair in many ways to both the healthcare professionals and the people who are trying to access that care. These are problems that are well above my pay grade, you could say, because they're such complex challenges that I don't think anyone has clear solutions for. But the truth is that yes, for in the average Indian with a rare disease, and this is something I want to point out as well, rare disease advocacy globally assumes that the diagnosis has been made. Once you have a rare disease diagnosis, you can be associated with a patient organization. You can find someone advocating for you, but it can take 7 years to get your diagnosis. So what are you doing in that time, and who is helping you? There is nobody. And so yes, people are going from pillar to post. They go years and years. We don't have the numbers, but that duration might be much longer for economically backward, uneducated people not speaking the language in India. There's really no statistics on that, unfortunately.
No, and India is very, very. It's a country of extremes, isn't it? It's
very much so.
Poverty, and it's going to be a hard one to tackle. So the next part, what I really wanted to get into was a bit more about international, like sort of patient advocacy, what that looks like, and maybe from your perspective, what's the biggest gap you notice when you get involved in those sort of Western research projects and thinking about what patients and the reality is, and how is that different, I would say, for someone in your position?
So I think that the biggest gap is that we've covered this a little bit, that the assumption is that the patient is one homogeneous collective, that they're all the same, that they all think the same, that they all behave the same, that when we're considering patient engagement and patient involvement, if we're doing it for one, we're doing it for all. We're doing it in English primarily. That does not apply to a country like India. There are 22 official languages. There is insane economic, urban, rural, religious-based divisions, and healthcare access is heavily influenced also by religion. There are alternative forms of medicine, or Ayurveda, homeopathy, various things that are recognized by the government as well, that people choose to adopt for themselves. And so I think that the main gap is the idea that that you can adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that one. And just to do a little plug for your podcast, not just patients, and it's a really interesting podcast, award-winning as well. But you talk a lot about meaningful patient involvement, and what does that meaningfully look like for South Asian patients specifically, and how far do you think the industry is from delivering it?
So you mentioned that India is a country of extremes, and I have some statistics actually to back that up. Because I had given a talk some time ago on cultural and societal nuances to patient engagement in India. And essentially, there are more than 1.4 billion people in India, but at least 9 in 10 lack basic health literacy. India has some of the world's best hospitals and most skilled experts, but 47% health expenses are out of pocket.
Wow.
About 86% households possess at least one smartphone with internet access, but only 43% rural and 68% urban menstruating women use menstrual hygiene products like sanitary napkins, tampons, and menstrual cups.
Yeah.
So now imagine trying to design clinical trials or patient engagement initiatives without knowing some of these realities, right? Even, and like I was talking about the religious influence, something like fasting is so prevalent across religions in India. You have Hindus fasting on different days of the week, you have Muslims fasting in different months of the year, and you have medical regimens that will absolutely not consider things like that in a clinical trial protocol. But patients will not enroll if it does not comply with their religious norms, right? And
Yeah.
have you ever heard of a clinical trial protocol in accommodating something like that? So, I mean, really meaningful engagement, meaningful involvement is inviting people who really understand the system to design with the people doing the designing and iterating along the way, but also then taking stock of what went wrong when you don't hit recruitment targets, retention targets, not just moving on to the next trial and calling it a fail, but
Yes.
why did this not happen? And maybe talking more to patients would be a start.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. 100%. I think there's not enough learning going on. It's just silos, and that sort of gets partitioned off, and then we do the next study, but then we're making the same mistake. So I think, yeah, some shared
Yeah.
intelligence is always interesting. Okay. So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I suppose, so if a pharma company wanted to genuinely include South Asian patients in their research, let's just say, assume this is now a study happening in the UK, maybe in the Midlands, we're looking at type 2 diabetes. What would they actually need to do differently? And I think you might have just touched upon it anyway, but what do pharma, the clinical trial designers, need to do differently to make it more inclusive for, say, South Asian people specifically?
Yeah, I think diabetes is the perfect example of studies, that tie into religion and fasting and things like that, right? Because similar situation with regard to food and food timing and things like that. But essentially, I think that again, when a lot of trials now have patient involvement, but as a tick box, you involve one patient and you assume that that's covered. uh, but you need to involve representative patients of the specific groups. You need to do more advisory boards and have your advisory boards as well cover the representation, and then really dig into some of these nuances around the protocol, not at such a very high level, where essentially you're getting your patient involvement so that you clear the regulatory requirements of, yes, patient involvement done, but your patient involvement is serving the need of actual recruitment and retention and meaningful engagement. And
Yeah. And if you don't mind me asking, because it would be interesting, but from your perspective, like I call it the third place, right? So where you've been to the UK, you've been here in Europe, and how do we engage with South Asian people? Because I think it's very fragmented. So I personally think WhatsApp is the best place. My mum still gets all these videos from India, about Baba this, Baba Ramdev this, do this exercise, do that, don't eat this. And I wonder because there is a bit of misinformation being shared. Like, how do we engage with South Asians? So let's say like a corporate entity, how does that happen? And how is it feasible?
are you talking about the platform, the actual tool?
Yeah,
perhaps? So I've honestly always worked in global settings, and I prefer email or LinkedIn, but when I happen to work in Indian settings, I honestly get surprised at how WhatsApp is the first port of call. I might meet someone in a conference, and then the next thing I know, they're messaging me on WhatsApp, and that becomes the primary business point of contact. I don't think it's frowned upon at all, like in business circles, to use WhatsApp. I'm sure that there would be loads of compliance issues and loops that a pharma company or a biotech company would have to jump through to be able to use something like that. But it's definitely worth considering, I think, for the market.
Yeah, no, it's just a thought I had in my head. So the last question, and it's one of those, I ask this in every meeting: what would you want someone who's building a clinical trial or even a patient engagement strategy to take away from this conversation today?
I think India has emerged as one of the leading clinical trial destinations in the world. That makes sense because of the sheer population. You can get numbers, you can hit targets potentially, but does that mean you're meaningfully involving patients? Does that mean you're increasing representation? Potentially not, if your sites are only in Delhi and Mumbai and maybe Hyderabad. If you have an investigator who is screening patients based on whether they're likely to stay in the trial, whether they're likely to understand things, even if the protocol doesn't specifically mention a language requirement, there might be a clinician bias that comes in there, right? Whether you like it or not. So I think essentially the one thing to take away would be that they would only be designing trials meaningfully and including representation if they're thinking about the whole India and not just these cream segments, the 5% that I happen to fall into.
Yeah. I think we've reached 2:30, but we've just got a comment in from Connie Montgomery, who is saying,
Connie.
So she's basically saying, thank you very much for discussing the gap of recognizing diversity in every way, even spiritually, because one size does not fit all nowhere on the planet. So when healthcare interactions, research of clinical trials consider these findings meaningful, participation changes, and so does retention, recruitment, and representation. And she said, thank you for sharing your perspectives on South Asian participation in trials, Clarinda. So thank you very much, Clarinda. And I think that's a great way to sign off. And yeah, it was a great conversation. And I look forward to maybe hosting another one soon, maybe in India next time. Yeah.
Thanks, Ashish.